It is my privilege that we can continue our study about the education in the last days of this world's history. And we have the subtitle today, The Church and Education. We all remember that the time is short in which we must come from no trust in God almost to full trust in God. But in order to become fully trusting God, we need to change our identity to know that we are His children. For this, He gave us His Son, and the Holy Spirit brings us His life. He gives us the scale, the law, the textbook, the nature, and the Bible. And He governs the process of growth by additional difficulties, by crises, by conflicts, by enmities, by disease, or whatever He finds out that He can bring us to growth, He will do it. Because only He knows how short the time is. Only He knows what it costs to come to full trust in Him. As I see the perplexing time that I'm in, I realize that He uncovers the unbelief of my heart. And I say, Lord, have mercy. There are so simple things that are so heavy to be put there in our minds and in our hearts so that we could have fully trust in our Father. There is a battle in which we must go on. And the Lord has and puts His hand on us. At least He puts it on me, and I believe on you as well. Because if He wants us to be finished, He must do His job. Yes, it's a painful job for Him and as for us. But if at the end we can give our thesis, we can become the light of the world, I think every difficulties, everything He brought in our life was worth it. Even though when we are something in difficulties, we believe this is not survivable. Well, that's our unbelief in God. That's our selfish nature that lives for itself. But when we have reached this point in time, that we shout away the loud cry, then we are over the top. Yes, there will be other difficulties, but as we have learned the lesson of trust, even in the time of Jacob's trouble, we will know who we believed, we will know whom we have trusted, and we will keep on no matter what comes until we see Him coming and He brings us into the free school in heaven. As we have seen in the presentation the last time, we have seen that education is worship and worship is salvation and education is salvation. So we speak about synonyms. Because that what you teach is what you are going to, yes? So it is no separation between teaching and worship. And as a result, salvation. So if that's the truth, then what is the church? Well, if that's the truth, then the church must be a place of worship and education. It was always God's plan that He has a place where He can teach people, not in the human wisdom, but in divine wisdom. And so from the beginning, teaching and worship were combined. The prophets were in schools of prophets, and they educated others. And they went into city to educate the people. Because those who were the worshippers, those who were the known of things, had to educate the persons from the church, from the community. So what was the center of education? Of course, the scale, the non-changeable, individual dependency on the Creator. This basic law says that each individual must be dependent on his dependency, and we as humans, our spirit, can only be dependent on God. He has no other place or other power to plug in. God is the only power source where our spirit can plug in. So knowing that, that's the foundational law. And it's amazing that this law is not so clearly understood and known. And then, of course, we need the story of redemption. We need to see the history of how God has dealt with his people, what his plan is to bring people out of their needs. We need the Bible to instruct us in all the past patterns that God made, and also in any things that she's teaching of. And she's teaching a lot about humanity and what he's composed of, and so on. So, these are the two things, the scale and the Bible. Because this is God's word, where we have to live from, and where we have to do and act on. Now, let's look to the schools or to the church. How was the church in which Jesus grew up? We knew he grew up in Nazareth, and the inspired writing says tradition had in great degree supplanted the scriptures. So with other words, the law was made void. Jesus told it several times. It says, you put aside the law of God to put your vain traditions, which are nothing than laws of man, instead. He had to rebuke them. They didn't listen so much. And of course, the scriptures then are not important. Even though they studied it, even though it was there like it was central, it still was not central. So how did that happen? So during the time of Jesus, inspired writing says, the Jewish teachers gave their attention to matters of ceremony. The mind was crowded with material that was worthless to the learner. Does that sound familiar for what is taught today in the schools? I mean, in our Christian or Adventist schools? Material worthless to the learner. And that would not be recognized in the higher schools of the courts above. Now, if that what we teach here on earth is not recognized in the higher schools of above, it will keep us down on earth. It will not bring us nowhere. Then we miss worship, we miss salvation, we miss everything. Exactly like the Jewish nation in Jesus' time. So they put tradition instead, and so they blocked everything. How is it in our schools today? Are they better? If the servant of the Lord would live today, would she write something different if she would come to your school or to your institution? Or would she say the following? In their search after knowledge, they turned away from the source of wisdom. The great essentials of the service of God were neglected. The principles of the law were obscured. Now, what kind of a school will have ever the approbation of God, in which the principles of the law are obscured? Friends, but we believe, we keep it. How do we know? Well, by what we teach. That which was regarded as superior education was the greatest hindrance to real development. How much? Greatest hindrance. You see, we have superior education. We have higher education. We have universities. What would she write about them? Would she visit them? Under training of the rabbis, the powers of the youth were repressed. Their minds became cramped and narrow. Is that the purpose of the church and education? To cramp your mind and to make it narrow? Or is it made to brighten it? To know more and more and to dive in a never-ending journey of understanding and of knowledge and of wisdom. But if we are going like this, we cannot fulfill the plan that God has. Even though we might have a church school or a church university or whatever we will have, what does it matter if it bears the name of our church as Adventist Church or whatever church you are in, and it is not preaching or it's not teaching that which comes from God? It's worthless. Worthless. The child Jesus did not receive instruction in the synagogue schools. With other words, would Jesus go into any school of our church today if he would be born? Or would he ignore them? Would he search other ways of education? As he advanced from childhood to youth, he did not seek the schools of the rabbis. He needed not the education to be obtained from such sources, for God was his instructor. You see, he did not find a place. How beautiful it would have been when Jesus would have come, and his church would have had the right school, even for him, in which God would have been the instructor through the rabbis. But unfortunately, it was not so. And so I see it today as well. If God is not the instructor in our schools, and we can see that if God is the instructor in our school, as we look to the curriculum and to the content, what they are taught. In which curriculum do you have found the knowledge about the human being? That he is a soul composed of body and spirit. In which curriculum do we have the clearness of how the mind works with the body and the body with the mind? Where do we search for how thoughts are working and what they are? And how do we move and do all things? So, in which school do we teach that? But that is elementary stuff, because it's the first page of the Bible and the second. And that teaching about humanity goes to the end. But if that is not understood, who will learn anything? A few years ago on a medical conference, I spoke about the human structure, that humans must have a spirit that guides the body. And my fellow colleagues, Adventists, rebuked me strongly. And later wrote that there is no such thing, that a thought has no physical support. That is, a thought must arise from a physical thing. Now, you might think that's a small thing. Well, the temptation of the devil are always small. But if thoughts arise from the body, then evolution is correct. Because then evolution can create. Because God did everything through his thinking. And Jesus was his mouthpiece. He said, and it was. And it's spirit that governs matter, not matter governing spirit as it's taught in our schools. So it's just a small thing, but I consider a decisive thing. A decisive thing. Because it leads you either to Christ or not to Christ. The divine organization. So how did God organize things? Now he built everything on one foundation, which I think is very smart, very nice. And if this is the platform of the church or any institution, then on that platform is the law. That platform is the law. The law of individual dependency of God. So here the people are all dependent on God, everyone for himself. And that is never changeable. The individual comes first. And that's why all things, the foundation of the church and its organizations is the basic law of every organization. The foundation law is the basis because we can never eliminate this law. It always works. It always functions. And I hope we all have understood that until now. But in the moment God put two people together, that was in marriage, he had to add additional laws. These laws control the institution. Now, why are they necessary? You see, in our body, everything works according to commands. So you don't need laws to say, finger, look, you have to orient after this like this, or because he has his limits, he knows how to, he has to work only in a certain way. But when you put two individuals together and you want them to reach a goal, and they have to have a common interest, then there must be a law that governs that. So that every individual in that community, it's only two, it's marriage now, knows what his place and purpose is. So, if you have one, you don't need additional laws. But when God brought Adam to Eve and Eve to Adam, he had to give them additional laws so that they should work correctly and efficiently together in order to be productive. And he knows what he has given them all for instructions, but we find the Bible is full of additional laws. Find additional laws for the king. Yes, when Israel asked for a king, then God said, well, tell them the laws that are connected to a king. And they agreed, and yes, we want. They did not know what they wanted. So, when God then grew the family, then you have for each individual in that group, in that institution, in that community, you must have an occupation for itself. Because they must govern themselves. As humans, as I mentioned, we are souls, and the spirit cannot be commanded to say, do this, do that. He must understand things to do them. He must convince himself how to do them. And he must coordinate himself with the others so that that goal is reached. So you cannot just command in an institution and say, you do this, you do this. No, that's why the laws govern each one, that he knows together with the others what his job and duty is. Because we have a spirit and we're not robots. Now, looking to the first church organization, Jesus took 12 apostles and they made many disciples. And as they grew and as the challenges grew for supplying the needs for all the widows, because they did not just come together to eat and drink, they had to supply the poor and all that. They had to sit down and said, well, they're inefficient. And so they had to search for 7 deacons. So they became more efficient, so that the apostles could do another job and the deacons could occupy themselves with that. What was their occupation? To see if all the widows, all the poor people would get their food, would get their supply, would get their whatever needs they had. So, and as the churches grow and as they became from city to city, then they organized in churches, like even before the Jewish people were organized in synagogues all over the place where they have moved. So in an organization, everyone has its place and occupation, and he must communicate with each other so that not the one that just does this and now everyone is dependent individual of God. That's the first thing, and then the next is, okay, let's see, how do I fit with my capacities together with the others? What went wrong with the organization of the people of Israel? If God made it so clear, the first thing that always happens is that the scale disappears. In the moment you put away the basic law, the individual dependency on God, and you put the institutional laws at the bottom, you cannot do that except you break the law, because you cannot replace the bottom. If you want to replace the bottom, you must break it. And so when the secondary laws become main legislation, the institution becomes the focus, the purpose. But an institution is not the purpose. It must fulfill a purpose. So this is where things are getting very, very difficult. The people of Israel put the additional laws higher than the law of God. Is it different with us today? Sometimes I hear saying that people say, but our church doesn't believe like that. I say, is that an argument? I mean, am I going to believe what the church believes? Was belief ever dependent? Does it come to the basic law, to the additional laws? I must know that the additional laws, or I must know that faith can never, ever be based on a church's belief. It must be my belief. But if it's not my belief, it's the church beliefs, and I trust the church leaders that they were leading well, then I'm lost. Because in matters of conscience, in matters of faith, only the individual matters. Never, ever the institution. But you see, that's the switch. that can be done very interestingly and very smoothly, that it's not even perceptibly done. But what we see today is the fulfilling of this. So as conclusion, the church therefore consists of people and of an institution. Are they equal? Yes. In order for God to fulfill the job, both need to work together. But now looking to history, we must find that that was not happening. That they never kept the balance. That the institution took over the part of the basic law. God had to reject 10 tribes. God had to destroy the city called by his name. He said, I put my name there. And the temple in which he appeared from heaven the first time and inaugurated it with his glory. What a great manifestation, what a great temple, what a splendor for the eyes and for the heart. But God, because they exchanged the places, which is the devil's strategy. They exchanged the places. Then he had to break the institution. When the institution takes over and is stronger than the individual, and the institutional belief is guideline and not that of the Bible, then that is a place of no return. And yes, they trusted and said, oh, this is the temple of God. There were so many prophets that said, we are the children of God. God promised us. They read the promises from the prophets and said, we won't be destroyed. God cannot destroy this beautiful temple. Look to it. With how much love it was built. He will not do that. He cannot do that. Well, they were taught something different. When the second time the temple was rebuilt, Jerusalem was rebuilt, they thought now it will stay forever. And even if Jesus came and inaugurated the temple, when he left the last time, he said, your house is going to be left desolate. And so it happened. But the Jewish people, 70 years later or 40 years later, when the destruction came, they were hiding in the temple, thinking that God will protect them there. Because it's the temple of the Lord. It's the temple of the Lord. Well, the temple of the Lord with the wrong content is no temple of the Lord. A church that has the name of God but has not the content of God is not of God. But this is very hard to be understood. The Israelites didn't get it. And I see that we are not getting it either. That's why in John 10, we read the story of the church. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfolds, that climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. And when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, And the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. And a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not of the voice of a stranger. Now that is exactly the first law. The sheep need a shepherd. And they only come in by the door. And the door is Christ. Everyone that doesn't come to that door is a thief and a robber. But he leads them out of the stall. And it says here in verse 16, or let's read from 14, I am the good shepherd, and know my sheep, and am known of mine. As the Father knoweth me, even so know I the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Now, this is future. God needs to destroy the institutions and reduce the people of them to a faithful remnant who know his voice. And those who don't believe that, let's look back to history. Because the churches of today, no matter which, are not better than the church in Jerusalem and in Nazareth and wherever they were at the time of Jesus. They were corrupt. They were having their own affairs. They were not searching God's interest. And so they didn't believe that God would give them up. But he gave them up. They were all destroyed, and the blood flew on the streets of the temple because they thought God will protect them in his temple. So as this text suggests, we are coming in a time where all stalls, or all folds, must be sifted. What will God do with the institution of his end-time church and of his churches? Because you see, he has other sheep in other folds. So, but in order to reach that goal, I believe the institution must be broken down. And it says here there will be not an institution, even though she would be needed, but since the time is so short, God will work with just a few people and will bring them all to his fold. And from the ruins of all these folds will come together one fold and one shepherd. And since things were going so fast, we don't know how to organize. Probably there will not be much organization like the first church had, but every place. We were wondering if we can baptize them or not. But they will call on the name of the Lord and be saved. So even though it is a dramatic thing that God needs to judge the institutions and his people, without this judgment, the work cannot be finished. May be found faithful among those who listen to his voice and do his job. Amen.